Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to our new assignment, True Spies Debrief. In the True Spies episode, Blinking Red, Gina Bennett described her experience as the first analyst to issue a warning about Osama bin Laden back in 1993. After 34 years, Gina parted ways with her career in counterterrorism. And today, she's teaching and writing about what she describes as a new paradigm for national security. True Spies producer Morgan Childs caught up with Gina to hear about her latest work, to better understand how a hunter-gatherer theory might help make the United States and the world more secure.
Well, I want to formally welcome you. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you. And I have a big question for you straight out of the gate, which is...
Oh, boy.
You spent 34 years in counterterrorism before retiring from the agency to focus on teaching ethics. And so I'm curious what it was about the first chapter of your career that inspired a pivot to ethics and intelligence.
No, that's easy. I think... It's really two things that come together. First, it's the common narrative of espionage, spy work, the CIA, all of it, whether it's us or other countries, other parts of the U.S. intelligence community, this common perception of what we do and how we do it, probably as importantly, how we do it, whether it's from movies or books or just media, and I don't blame anyone for making it entertainment. And the media, of course, most media, they do their best, but it's hard for people to know what it's really like and what you really do. Not everybody is going to listen to your podcast and be informed that way. So the common perception of what, spies do. Basically, there's no ethics involved. It's all about the ends. It's very Machiavellian. The ends justify the means, and that's what you do. So there's that was just always in the background, and I, just felt like, gosh, this is what people really think of us. And then knowing on the inside how often we talk about the long-term impact or consequences of even small decisions, I think would astound people. And so, and I myself, obviously, very dedicated to the Constitution. So, some of my ethics course, or a lot of it, actually focuses on what that means to take the oath of office and, swear to defend with your life, if possible, or if necessary, to protect and support the Constitution. The two things together just were very jarring. Like the perception that we'll do anything that we can and break every law and just, completely ignore laws and the Constitution and ethics and what we actually do. And so that was really the inspiration in trying to teach the next generation of incoming national security personnel, because, at Georgetown, we have lots of people who are going to go into all avenues of national security. And I'm fortunate to be able to go around and do some guest lecturing at other universities and institutions, which is great. That no, it is very ethical in the sense that it really requires and demands every single person who's in it to stop and understand the weight of their decision-making, the weight of their brainstorming, like the consequences of what might come from your decision, and who who and what you have pledged to serve. It's, not yourself. It's not necessarily the mission. It's not about getting the job done no matter what the costs at all. It's not. The promise is to support and defend the Constitution, to make sure you uphold it. And you have to think about the means. And so that's, yeah.
Was there a turning point for you?
Well, I think a lot of it, so many of my turning points, whether it's about hunter-gatherer, national security, or ethics, hinge on, to some degree, 9/11. And it's not so much it is partially the attack, but it's also the reaction to it. So on the ethics side, realizing that, with 9/11, the immediate aftermath, you saw so much debate about this issue. How far do we go? What are we doing? How do we do it? What's going to be the long-term consequence and perception of doing it that way? All of those things were in constant debate. And I'm not saying that I agreed or anyone agreed with every decision that was made. I don't think that's possible. But look, we didn't have a blueprint. So the fact that it was a conversation, a constant conversation from the bottom to the top of this government was, I think, the best we could have done. It was uncharted water. It was, for a lot of people, unanticipated. And like I said, we didn't have a blueprint for what do we do with this kind of adversary? What do we do with this kind of attack? How do we do the right thing by the American people without doing the wrong thing by the America future? So I just felt proud that those debates occurred and they never stopped. And even now we're still going back and asking, where did we make mistakes? What did we do right? What didn't we do right? That's to me, that's ethics. It's a constant process. It's not just a boom, there's no right or wrong.
I'm thinking about, I've heard you say that you were never convinced that the threats that you dealt with in those 34 years were existential to America, which is such a massive statement for somebody who's worked in the environments and the situations that you have.
Yeah, no, never. That is really the most jarring experience for me over the course of my 34 years and, before and after, really, is having a very different conceptualization of what security is. And I felt it immediately going into government. I was 21, I guess. God, it's hard to believe, but it's so long ago. But right from the very beginning, this idea of security being the absence of threats was just insane to me. Because, if that's how you're defining your personal security or your national security or global security, climate security, anything, then you're always going to be insecure because threats exist. It's part of life. It's part of whether it's animal life or plant life or human life, it's part of life. So I always felt that security was something much deeper. And yes, it makes it harder because it seems more intangible. But, to me, ultimately about autonomy and having the freedom and the right to choose who you are, your identity, what you contribute, what you do in the world at a national level, what government you want, how you want power to be executed over you, this form of governance that you choose and securing that form of government. That to me is security, and the rest of it is more safety. And don't get me wrong, safety is very important, but it doesn't necessarily result in securing those things. I can be physically safe and not be personally secure. I think our country can be physically safe and not be secure in its governance.
So maybe outline for our listeners who haven't read what you've written and heard what you've had to say about this paradigm and sort of what you mean when you refer to the current national paradigm and how your thinking and writing provides another frame of reference.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and stop me if I get too academic, but in security studies, security theories, whether they're national level or international security theories, they focus on defining the threats to security a certain way and the tools and instruments that you then use as a country or an international community or alliances, et cetera, to deal with those threats. And the predominant security theory has been, for well over 100 years, realism, which really stems from the idea that, states, nations, are clear-eyed and realistic about how they view the world and understand the risks and rewards and the pros and the cons and, rational actor theory about leaders and governments, wanting to continue to survive, just very kind of survivalist approach. And, you can understand coming out of World War I and II, where we had 100 million casualties over the course of 2 wars and, atom bombs, why we would have that realistic approach and why it held for so long. The idea of alliances and deterrence and the use of military, really having decisive force against your adversary and building alliances around that as deterrence, so as to prevent and prevent the provocation that would lead to another nuclear war, for example. All of that, again, coming out of the 2 world wars makes sense. Coming out of the Cold War makes sense. But, you get into the 2000s, and at least in the United States, you realize going into, 2020, for example, the elections in 2020 were pivotal, as were the 2024. And most Americans don't know that there are 3 branches of the U.S. government. Most Americans don't know anything really about how democracy works, nor do they really care. But also they just don't. They don't understand the risks of it. And there are a lot of people in America, I forget the numbers now, but it was like 83% who think democracy is broken. And so what did we secure? If you have a populace that doesn't know what its government is or how it's being governed, doesn't understand where power comes from or how it's executed, how it's delivered, and isn't really all that interested in it, then what difference does it make if we were a caliphate or a communist country or anything else, right? If the government doesn't matter, then really, if all we really want is safety and, the endurance of our borders and our people and our buildings and our transportation and all that, then the government wouldn't matter at all. And you say that out loud and suddenly it sounds insane, but that's kind of what we're projecting. And so, from that, I just continued to ask why. Why is it not, on the one hand, why is it that realist security theories have only focused on the tangible and the physical, but also why don't they focus on the intangible and the securing of governance? Really the securing of the chosen governance of the people. Mm-hmm. And because, when you're secure as an individual, somebody says stuff about you, it doesn't hurt. I mean, it's stupid, right? You can brush it off. It's like, yeah, whatever. I've got it good. I don't really care if you don't understand or don't like it. And if you think about that, right, does it matter? Does it matter if another country hates us or if Al Qaeda wants us to be, something different? Doesn't matter. Yes, they can hurt us, but ultimately they are not going to destroy the United States of America unless we change the form of government that we are. Uh-huh. Right? That's why I say they're not existential threats. The only existential threat comes from us. From our deciding not to be this democratic republic that we have been for so long. And that's really the kernel of why I think a new theory is necessary. And I started working on the research and to build the course that I teach at Georgetown, the Hunter-Gatherer National Security, based on that. Like, there's something missing. Why is this missing? And then, in time, I think I found the answer. So,
yeah, and we were talking earlier before we started recording about trying new things on, and you've, among other things, tried on anthropology and neurology. I mean, sort of tell me about how all of these academic disciplines have informed your thinking about this.
Well, one thing is, at the agency, one of the jobs that I had for a while, which I really am so grateful to have had the opportunity, was managing the analytic tradecraft for the agency. So really being the caretaker of how we analyze across all of the disciplines of the agency, which was very substantial responsibility, intimidating, but I also loved it, and I love the people, love the work. But you really have to learn critical thinking. So I'm always asking, why is it this way? And what are we missing? And what if we flipped the assumptions around? Things like that. I mean, I just can't help myself. And I hate it when information or knowledge is siloed, because that is automatically limiting. And, academia is siloed, sciences are siloed, everything is siloed, because, you have to have that in order to learn. But then it becomes a habit to not ask, well, what does anthropology say about, my kneecap? Or what does anthropology say about security? What is anthropology? Or what does neuroscience tell us? And that doesn't happen a lot. And so I like to do things that don't happen a lot. I guess that's part of it. But at any rate, trying to get to the answer of why realist theorists like Kenneth Waltz and, all of the Morgenthau, the people who invented realism theories, all the way back to, if you want, Thucydides and Machiavelli, why was it so focused on this one concept and not the other? And what had they excluded as they went along in their writing? And it didn't take long to understand that what they excluded was what was going on in the social sector of life. They were only worried about war, and they weren't worried about peace. It's as if peace was the absence of war, when peace itself is so much harder to build and maintain. It's not the absence of something. It is hard work. It's the achievement of something. And going back even further, that's why I had to get back to anthropology, because, alphabetic writing has only been around since about 2000 BC. So you really have to go farther and farther back. And I, hit on, I think, in my mind, it's, as we became a settled societies and no longer the hunter-gatherer, nomadic hunter-gathering communities as we were for hundreds of thousands of years. So 10 to 15,000 years ago, when we discovered that we could farm and stay put, one of the unintended consequences of that no one really thinks about, I think, is that we divided into public and private spheres. The public sphere being initially where surplus food was traded, and then the private sphere where everything else occurred. But as time went on, the public sphere became the dominant place for trade, for economy, for then wealth and feudal systems and ownership and ruling and government and politics and philosophy and religion and law and you name it, right? That's where everything came out of the public sphere. And in the private sphere, nobody was paying any attention. And it wasn't recorded. So it's not about, I'm not talking about genders. I know gender is part of it, but even if you flip them, it really doesn't matter whether it was men or women in either one. The fact of the matter is, the roles of survival and thriving were separated into two different places. And one was kept private and the other was exchanged and grown and fostered and eventually recorded into writing. But that doesn't mean that all the work that was happening transparently in the open for hundreds of thousands of years when people were nomadic went away or were no longer important. So there's a whole body of knowledge from the people who had been gatherers, who were gatherers, caretakers, strategic planners, innovators, all of the work to ensure survival and progress and thriving and knowledge transfer from one generation to the next that was happening inside domiciles has been lost. It's not in history. Mm. And so all of the skill sets that come with that were not incorporated into security theories. You just have so many theorists who look at what's happening there as soft stuff, women's work or domestic care. It's just, that's what we protect. But there's nothing from that transfers into the public sphere. And that is so backward. Of course, if what's important in the public sphere is important in the private sphere, what's important in the private sphere is important in the public sphere too, because it was, like I said, for the vast majority of human history, all done out in the open and very transparent. So we have lost a whole set of priorities and skills that, had we not had that separation of spaces for those activities, I think we would have incorporated in our security theories. So really what I'm trying to do with hunter-gatherer national security is bring it back in. And like I said, it's not about gender because men can be gatherers and caretakers and strategic planners and innovators too. And women clearly can be hunters and protectors and providers and defenders. So, you have to get rid of the gender lens of it and really just think about it in terms of roles and the roles that we're missing in national security strategies and application in any country where, if you're shoring up your own public's understanding of the government, especially if it's a chosen government, like with a democracy, not just their understanding of it, but their trust in it and their desire to engage in it and be active in it. Once you have that investment, it ensures the durability of it. It's just like with children. You invest in teaching them, the, good behaviors. You want them, your job as a parent is to ensure that they can thrive and exist and be contributing members of society without you. Mm-hmm. That is your job. Mm-hmm. That is the sole responsibility. And that is the security that you pass to them, is their ability to do that and then pass it on to their own children and so forth and so forth. Government should be doing the exact same thing as a national security imperative, and it's not.
Well, what is the relationship between your two national security mom books and this more recent work? Hearing you say that you have to get rid of the gendered lens makes absolute sense, but it also makes me wonder if you reflect on those books with any kind of, if you would approach those books differently now that you're sort of reframing your thinking.
No, I see the hunter-gatherer national security theory really as building on those books. They're national security mom because I'm a mom, mm-hmm. and I'm not a dad, and a father is not the same thing as a mother, and a mother's not the same thing as a father. Somewhere in the middle we can create parent. But because I really only like to write from what I know, so mm-hmm. I'm a mom, and that's where I wrote from. Although most of that advice is really just, the parental advice that we give our kids and why that was useful or why that could be useful if we applied it as a country, and thought about it as the government providing the same kinds of services, if you will, to the nation mm-hmm. and the people. Again, for me, it's about thinking of security as something beyond safety. And as I said in my first book, I can lock the doors, I can have smoke detectors, I can make sure the house is safe, I can make sure my kids have coats on when they go out, in the winter, or I can try anyway. I didn't always succeed, but I can't stop them from, falling in love and having their heart broken. I can't stop them from or prevent their being crushed when they're rejected from a, position that they want at work, or I can't protect them from all of the pain that's going to happen. All I can do is make sure they're resilient and capable of going on afterwards and continuing to thrive. And so that, that work that we do as a parent, and we are so emotionally invested in, we're very passionate about that. I want to see that in our citizenry, and that kind of investment in the endurance and the durability and the constitution of this country's ability to thrive for generations to come. That's really what National Security Mom and 1 and 2 was about. Mm-hmm. And I think the national, the hunter-gatherer national security theory that I'm starting to, really build is a more academic, more research version of that. Sure. It's not as intuitive. The National Security Mom was just very intuitive.
Mm. How is it being received by your former colleagues, or do you feel like you're in a bit of a void here?
Well, it's interesting. Most of my colleagues who've bothered to read either the books or my article of Lice and Men that explains the the hunter-gatherer national security theory, are just like, yeah. They'll say, yeah, of course. Of course. You're stating the obvious, which I am. Yeah. I absolutely am. I think the question is, okay, if it's the obvious, then why aren't we doing it? Where's the disconnect? And I have had some former colleagues who, I was in awe of as a little analyst, a baby analyst years ago, who've reached out and have said, yeah, I've read this and this is amazing. And I rarely read anything that's like new knowledge, and you're building new knowledge, and, how's it being received? And I'm like,
you're shaking your head.
It just, oh yeah, sorry. It just doesn't, it's, the most common response is, yeah, this just doesn't seem relevant.
Oh no.
Like, okay. It's not, it's too soft or squishy, or it's not relevant to, China and Ukraine and Russia and da, 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 da. And I'm like, well, it's relevant to America.
And one might argue all of those other places.
Yeah, yes, I know. It is very hard, on the academic side. It was a lot easier for me in government when I was, at the agency, and obviously where we pride ourselves on creating new knowledge. It was a lot easier to get an audience that was willing to think, that was not so bought into its own biases that it wasn't willing to hear something different. I used to say, think what you think, but don't believe in what you think. Because that's the only way for you to continually embrace the challenge that is necessary. So when you think something, whether it's a theory or anything else, an analytic line, you have to be willing to put it on the table, and cut the umbilical cord, put it on the table, and let it be its own thought, and have people attack it and just tear it up, because it only gets better from being challenged. And, I don't see that is necessarily the case in academia, where people's reputations and the curriculum and, just everything. There's so much halo bias around, the people who've created all of this. And it's so much easier to just keep teaching the same thing. And whether it's, especially like security studies journals, all like, our audience isn't going to really want to read this. And so it's like, okay, just keep reading what you already write and already know, and don't take on anything new. I can't force people.
Well, so you tell me, I mean, I know you call yourself a recovering Stoic, and I wonder if you feel like Stoicism is perhaps endemic to the intelligence community, and maybe if so, if it's kind of limiting our understanding of its role and its capabilities.
Oh, Stoicism is an absolute requirement of being in the intelligence community, especially if you're an analyst, because it really is based on the Greek tradition of removing yourself from emotion and passion in order to reach clarity and objective thought. And part of that, of course, is trying to identify your own personal, cognitive, organizational, cultural biases so that you can know what they are and mitigate them through various structured analytic techniques, methods that we would use for reducing the impact of biases. But, it's also to prevent value-laden judgment from entering into your analysis that is for, ultimately, the President of the United States on behalf of the American people and our allies. We want that information, we want that analysis to be as objectively created as possible. So you have to not have feelings. I mean, you can't feel when you're doing analysis because that automatically taints the objectivity of your thinking. So that's great, except we're all human beings and we do have a tendency to feel. So the reason I'm a recovering Stoic is because for a very long time I lived by that ethos of no feeling, right? And you get good at it. You just sort of divorce yourself of feeling. I always likened it to like a surgeon in the operating room. Something goes wrong, you don't want your surgeon panicking, right? They need to stay focused. And that's how you have to be in national security is certainly how you have to be in the intelligence community. So when you do that year in, year out, when you're in the middle of a crisis, you're watching 3,000 people die and you cannot feel because you have to stay clear-headed. You are in a group of a handful of people who know that there's a possibility of an attack tomorrow and you're working 24/7 to prevent it. You can't feel. You have to be, you have to be clear-headed. So when you start doing that, it is, like I said, year in, year out, and I worked my entire career in counterterrorism, so I never got a break from that type of crises. So you start getting, if you get good at it, then you advance and you get more crises and you get more responsibility. But you also find it very difficult to flip the switch when you're with normal people. Like, go home and feel. It's hard. It's very hard. And so I suffered from it. My family suffered from it, from me not having that emotional, I couldn't demonstrate or, show emotion. Not well, anyway. And so that's why I put myself into recovering from my Stoicism and trying to create, and I teach this in my ethics course because I think it's very important for people going into national security to think about it at the beginning. What are your strategies going to be for professional level Stoicism at the office when you need it, without shoving it so far back that it works as a toxin against you? And how are you going to prevent that professional Stoicism from seeping into your personal life?
So that reminds me of, you spoke at the Frank Church Conference last year, and I feel like for any listener who is remotely interested, it's an amazing talk and you can find it on YouTube and it's really worth seeking out. But you talked about Jennifer Matthews, who was your friend who was killed in Afghanistan, and she was criticized publicly by her own family, among other people, for going there when she had 3 kids at home. And you talked at the conference about being in a helicopter elsewhere in Afghanistan shortly after her death, and thinking about what you'd want your children to know if something were to happen to you. And you held up the Constitution, and you said that at the time you wanted your kids to know that you believed in we the people. And it's a really amazing moment, but you also have a really interesting sort of self-correction moment. You were speaking in the present tense, and you switched to the past tense, and it made me wonder. It seemed clear that what you felt conviction for had changed, and I'm curious to know how you feel your priorities have changed, and how you feel like the sacrifices that you're willing to make have changed.
One of the stories about Jennifer that I recount that is very painful is probably, what I discussed at the conference. Just knowing that she was afraid if something happened to her, that her kids would believe that she put work ahead of them, and how it struck me. We don't worry about that. I mean, it doesn't seem to be the worry that men traditionally have had. I mean, men have had the responsibility to go off and fight wars, and a lot of them obviously don't come back, but it seems more expected, I guess. And you don't really say, oh, well, my dad cared more about work than me. When I was in Afghanistan a few times, and Iraq also, but I thought about my kids, and I believed what I was doing. I believed what we were doing. I didn't agree with every single thing that we were doing, but I believed in the United States and the Constitution, and of course we the people. And I felt like, as I had said with my first national security mom, and the whole impetus of that book was a talk about work-life balance. And my conclusion was that what I do at home and what I do at work is the same thing. I am invested in my children's future, and I want them to live a fulfilled life, and I want them to be contributing members of society. I want them to put more good into the world. And I believe that they can best do that in a democracy. I believe democracies, because of their protection of individual freedoms and autonomy and the ability of the people to make the choices about power, enable my children to live their best lives. So I don't see them as separate. And I've really tried since then. My children were pretty young still when I was in Afghanistan, but I've tried since then. We've had these conversations. They're older. They can now understand. I'm very fortunate to be able to have those conversations with my kids. They can understand how I saw it that way. I mean, children want, they're focused on their short-term needs. They want you right here, right now, all the time. But I was focused on a long-term need for them. And I think, since retiring and, especially since like January 6th, and really coming to understand how limited trust is in not just government, some far off concept of elitist in power in Washington, but trust in democracy is in this country. It's very painful. It's painful to hear that. It's easier almost to die for your country than it is to live for it, in the sense of having to get up and choose every day to continue to believe in it and trust in our ability to do this self-government. It's getting harder and harder every day. And yet, again, like I said before, there's no foreign threat as existential to the United States as we are to ourselves. So I don't know. I think I still believe in the form of government. I still believe it can work, but I lose some level of hope and optimism about whether or not everybody else cares enough to make it work. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does, yeah. Does anything make you feel better?
it's a little extraneous, but I actually thought several years ago, in thinking about, is it possible we'll get to a day where we don't know if we freely elected our president, for example, or our senator, because there's so much deep fakes, interference, stuff like that we just don't know anymore. And we don't know. Well, did I really want to elect that person, or was I influenced to elect that? And we don't know. Okay, that sounds really bad. But actually, in our form of government, we have second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth chance at this. Because even if you question whether or not that person was who you actually wanted, you have the ability to hold them accountable. This is good. This can be good in that it forces you to be engaged and be informed and be an active citizen as opposed to a passive one. Because if you want to hold that person accountable, you got to monitor what they're doing, and is it what they said they were going to do, and is it what you thought that you wanted them to do, and what is the impact it's having on your daily life, et cetera, so that you can vote them out, right? Or be engaged in other kind of advocacy that works in a different direction. Okay, so set that aside. When the representative from North Carolina came out with the idea of a shadow cabinet, and a lot of people were like, what? He wrote a Washington Post op-ed about a shadow cabinet, like we need a shadow cabinet like the British have. And I think a lot of people thought that was crazy, or it was just kind of a reaction to a Democratic loss. Oh, well, then we're going to have this alternate, universe or something. But when I looked at it, I thought, you know what, this is actually a great solution for a different problem. If it were packaged that way, the idea of presenting an individual, a point of contact for every part of the executive and legislative and judicial branch, really, who would provide a counterpoint. So whether I don't care what administration it is, whatever administration is in power, when their Secretary of Defense comes out and says something, when their Secretary of Education comes out and says something, when their, the CDC comes out and says something, and you have a focal point counterpoint from the other party, being able to say, okay, well, this is what this administration is going to do. Our policy would have been this. This is how we would have done it. This is why we think what we would have done would have had different consequences. And here's what we're looking for, and very methodical and consistent. You would be educating the public. And you would be educating the public on something that they're not currently provided. And that is the throughput, from your vote to how it actually ends up,
right.
Because most people don't know. Like, I voted, and then you don't know what that person actually did, and you don't know whether or not the other person would have done a better job. This is education. This is higher level, information, so that, and it's meaningful to people, so they can figure out, oh, well, that would have had a completely different effect on my Medicare. That would have had a different effect on my pension. That would have had a different effect on, the safety of my home and my town. And the voters have the right to have that information, but who's providing it? Nobody. So I thought a shadow cabinet, as an institution, not a democratic shadow cabinet, but a shadow cabinet as an institution to provide that focal point conversation, which would then necessarily force the administration in power to debate at the same, with the same information on the same points. Wow. Suddenly we're getting the information to be able to do the pros and cons and decide. Because I really suspect that in America, we are all very mixed in our belief systems, and we are not uniformly Republican or uniformly Democrat. We're far more, mixed. And I think we would start to see that and then start demanding more collaboration and less fighting.
God, it's a great fantasy.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about your newest book. I'm curious, why fiction? And why this work of fiction?
Yeah. Yes. If two of them are dead, it's going to be published next year. I've had in my mind, wanting to bring Agent 355 from the Revolutionary War to life for a long, long time. And my way also of, trying to capture Jennifer and some other, women in the agency that I really admired was to create these two characters and have them, in many ways, explain a lot of what I've already said in National Security Moms and Hunter-Gatherer National Security. Hey, this is how it's done. This is why it's important. But in an accessible way, in a story I hope that people find compelling and thrilling at the same time. And, that's really why I bring to life people that I admire, some of whom are gone, some are still around. And it's sort of a tribute to all the men and women and gender minorities who do this silent, hard, really hard work. And the sacrifices are so far beyond what people understand because, like I said, you can lose your love, you can lose your family, you can lose a lot of things in this job. So that's why fiction just gives you the room to say things that, would be hard to say otherwise, through characters. So yeah, I have a whole series. And I also, again, because I have dabbled as a tradecraft program manager at the agency. I had the opportunity to dabble in a lot of very, very different things in terms of trying to provide analytic structure to various task force and things like that. So I love to put pieces together that other people aren't putting together that, remain stovepiped and say, you know what, maybe this is actually this and not that. So I wouldn't say conspiracy theories, but it's more explanation, making the explanation of why some phenomenon seems so hard to understand. But probably the answer is a lot more obvious than we are willing to admit. So you can do that in fiction too, give some answers to contemporary questions, fictionalize them, and then perhaps make people think, I wonder if that's actually true, and maybe we should look into that. So there's going to be a lot of that.
It's clearly not written by a Stoic, I would say.
No, I've tried to, put the passion into it for sure.
Well, it comes across talking to you.
Thank you.
I'm really grateful. Thank you.
I will say one last thing on the national security mom bit though, because now I'm a grandmother too. And my kids, I have one still who's a teen, but the rest of them are in their 20s, even 30s. For many, many years, I would tell my colleagues, look, I deal with toddlers, teens, and terrorists on a daily basis. And I can tell you right now, I'd take the terrorists any day over the toddlers and the teens. And, it's funny, but it's also true. And I think some people find it funny because they don't work in that, environment, but it is so true because toddlers and teens are yours, right? You're invested in them. Again, you're invested in them emotionally. It's harder work and it's more, it's constant. It never stops. The terrorists are more like I said, defending the physical safety, national safety as opposed to national security is a lot clearer. It's a lot more black and white, and you don't have the same emotional investment at all in that. And now I'm like, well, it's toddlers, teens, terrorists, and 20-somethings. Finding they're not that much easier. So anyway, I think the parallels just keep going.
Well, it is such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in for the debrief. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between Gina Bennett and True Spies producer Morgan Childs. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?